Hello everyone, this is Mr. Ferreira. It's good to speak to you again through the medium of these lessons being recorded. I will continue with the content as best as we can. The half term was good weather, but I also hope it was good for many of you. Though I know these times are quite uncertain, and Miss Harries and I have been genuinely concerned for you and just hoping that you're keeping as best as you can. The creative tasks that many of you have started to send me have been absolutely brilliant, and I'm always so proud of your effort and your work that you put into it. Keep them going, and I'm really pleased to hear from some of you that it's been a really good distraction from many of the things that are going around you. Looking at today's content, I've divided this into 5 sections. I've got quite a lot of detail, but it's really important that we understand risk factors, and the understanding of risk factors will certainly help us with the other parts of the addiction course. So we see simply that the course title is called Risk Factors, and it uses the word development of addiction. So we need to understand what that means. So we need to understand what are the risk factors. Now it's quite simply, they tell us that the risk factors we need to look at will be genetic vulnerability, stress, personality, family influences and peers. Now I always add to this age because in terms of peers, age is kind of a factor as well. So then we need to understand, well, what does a risk factor mean? Now, I'm going to go into quite a lot of detail with this, but the reason I'm doing this is because in the exam, and certainly as an examiner, I often feel that people don't explain what it exactly is the risk factor. So for example, we have stress being a risk factor. Now, it's the risk factor that develops the addiction. So a big part of that is this understanding that without stress, for example, we have less chance of developing addiction. It's not the only reason. We can see a number of other things. So I'm going to use an analogy. So if I'm walking along a path that is next to a cliff edge, okay, clearly that is a much more riskier path to walk on than one that is on a flat field somewhere. Okay, so by walking on that path, I'm putting myself at risk. Doesn't mean that I will fall, but I have more chance potentially of falling. Also, if I take the risk factor analogy even further, if, for example, I walk along that path and it is night time or it's windy, the chances are that, of course, it's going to have a much greater chance of me developing the situation of falling off the cliff or falling in some way. So it is possible that we could even have a combination of these risk factors that could be a factor that develops our addiction. The textbook covers it in what I would say a very brief fashion. I've gone into a lot more detail, mostly because I think it should be interesting to you, and also I don't want to push the content too far for now. I certainly felt that this year's exam there was a really good chance of there being a risk factor essay in it, or certainly an applied question. However, we will never know. So please read those pages and also kind of follow it in the content that I'm doing. So the first risk factor that I'm going to talk about, and the only one I'm going to do in this particular video, is genetic vulnerability. Now, the key to genetic vulnerability is, of course, we're familiar with the genetic image, the way that kind of the combinations of certain aspects of genes kind of work together. What we need to kind of get away from it is this idea that there could be a specific gene that makes you an addict. But what it does talk about is vulnerability. So it could be that a number of these particular combinations within your gene code could make you more or less vulnerable. So what we say in terms of understanding the risk factor is some people are born this way. Okay, and so we got to talk about genetic vulnerability, that you're born with genetic vulnerability, or a vulnerability to substance abuse, or some kind of unhealthy behavior. Now, of course, this could be socio-economic. However, we need to differentiate, put them in their different compartments for now, and kind of look at the specific kind of genetic aspect of that. So what we find is we inherit something that predisposes you towards drug dependence or addictive behavior. So that's what the risk factor is. So we can take two individuals. One individual has the risk factor of genetic vulnerability, and another individual doesn't have the risk factor of genetic vulnerability. And what I'm saying here is that if you've got this genetic vulnerability of perhaps a greater predisposition for drug dependence, then of course you have more chance of becoming an addict. For example, we see quite a lot of research there. Now what we'll notice is that in the knowledge part of this, I've got lots of studies. We need to take each of these studies for what they are. They're ultimately an example of how genetics may be used to explain addiction. We don't have to remember all their names, but certainly we could use some of their names in evaluation points. Or if we wanted to write at a greater depth, kind of your A's and A stars, you may want to use the names in order to help you explain your point. So this particular research took a large group of twins, okay, and looked at genetics and the environment, and looked at a specific form of addiction, gambling addiction. Okay. Now I also have these studies because I know that the next part of the course we will look at both smoking addiction and gambling addiction, so certainly we could use this in that section. And this is the key here. We see that monozygotic twins had a higher rate of being a pathological gambler. Okay, so we see here we have a comparison of 49% inheritability compared to 21% for dizygotic twins. So in other words, there is nearly 1 in 2 chance that both twins will develop the same gambling addiction. So that's quite a high. Now I know these numbers don't seem particularly high, but when we're talking about heritability, it's really important that we know that that's quite significant. We also can take these examples to other kind of research, and we have some research by a person called Vink, okay, who looks at also quite a large pair of Dutch twins, okay, and they find that for both men and women, okay, it says here individual differences in smoking were explained by genetics. What we mean by individual differences, okay, is that down to the individual, who they are. So in other words, down to the genetics explained why they were smokers. So what we have here is quite a big percentage down to genetics. Now, of course, what we also then can say is that 44% were down to genetics, that there's actually a larger percentage down to environmental factors. Now, of course, in an exam, we need to focus on the genetic component and not on the environmental component unless we are looking at evaluation. Okay, so we do know that the environment has a role to play. Now, what most people will then look at when they're looking specifically at genetics is to look at, well, which part of the body potentially is kind of making us more vulnerable, and a lot of people seem to think it's something to do with dopamine receptors. Okay, so it is possible that we have different genetic makeup that affect our genetic our dopamine receptors, and what we find is that having low levels of dopamine means that the brain itself does not get activated with reward. Okay, now I do need to explain this a little bit more clearly. Okay, so if you have a higher level of the neurotransmitter dopamine, it means little activities will reward you and you'll feel the pleasure. Okay, however, if you have fewer neurotransmitters, dopamine receptors, it means that you need more dopamine in order to feel the same way as somebody else who has more of the receptors. And so what we're finding is that actually if you have lower levels of these dopamine receptors, the chances are that you will do lots of activities that pump dopamine into your system and make you more likely to become an addict. So it says this means that anything that increases the amount of dopamine can produce strong feelings of euphoria. Okay, so another way that you can look at this is that if you have a high level of dopamine receptors, then if I take something that produces lots and lots of dopamine, I could potentially feel overwhelmed. And that feeling of being overwhelmed will not be euphoric, will not be pleasurable. So therefore the reward system stops me from wanting to repeatedly take that particular substance. However, in contrast, if I have fewer receptors, then we might find that this dopamine really kind of triggers me and really makes me feel absolutely wonderful, and therefore I'm more likely to become an addict. Now, before I continue, you might kind of hear the fan on my computer just going a little bit haywire. I don't know why lately that it's just been heating up a bit too much, and you can hear it, and so therefore I'll just continue with the video. Now, in order to demonstrate this whole idea of kind of dopamine receptors, it's not in the specification, but certainly some really interesting research comes from this person called Volker. She did absolutely brilliant research, which for me just has always kind of blown me away. Now, the key to her research is that she gave participants Ritalin. Now, Ritalin is a drug that we often give children who suffer from ADHD. It's safe because it's a slow releasing dopamine, a slow release of dopamine, so it's safe for children, and it's a very slight increase in dopamine rather than kind of a big spike like you might find in something like heroin. Okay, and so all she did is she gave this particular drug to a group of volunteers, and what she found that there were some people who enjoyed the experience, okay, and some people hated the experience. Now, of course, this is perfectly acceptable. We don't all need to enjoy taking some drug, okay. But what was interesting was when she started doing some brain scans, okay, because I feel like I might have gone over. When she did some brain scans, the two groups were quite clear. Those that had lower levels of the receptors were the ones that absolutely loved the experience. Those who had higher levels of receptors are the ones who hated it. So it could be that some people, the genetic vulnerability that they have is, of course, that they have fewer dopamine receptors. Blum looks at a lot of different research into addiction, and of course they're finding similar things. The A1 variant of dopamine receptors, so once again a decrease in dopamine receptors also seems to be prevalent in alcoholics compared to non-alcoholics. So hopefully you've seen that there's quite a significant kind of level of kind of evidence maybe pointing towards the fact that some of us might have a genetic vulnerability compared to others. Okay, and this has always been one of the things that I'd ever say would be concerned about, is that maybe we don't quite know what our genetic vulnerabilities are. Okay, I've got a number of just straightforward research support points and a couple of extra pieces of information. Certainly something like the Blum study could be used as research support as well. Okay, so I'm just building up kind of a picture here. Now, the reason I kind of moved this particular point to the evaluation point is because instead of using twin studies, it uses adoption studies. So you might want to use it as a combination with the twin studies. But basically, we have very, very similar kind of results. What we want in a twin study is that we want, obviously, people who've been adopted and don't live with their biological parent, and that we have at least one parent who's an addict. Okay, so in other words, the direct genetic link. Okay, and actually, quite predictably, we find that there's a much higher risk. Now, it doesn't seem to be a big number here, 8.6%, but certainly that's twice 4.2. So those children who were adopted and with no parents that were addicts had 4.2% chance of becoming an addict, but there was an 8.6% chance if they had one genetic parent. So it's quite significant that. So in other words, there's certainly a genetic vulnerability in there, and there are some campaigns in America where some people are trying to get drug addicts to voluntarily sterilize themselves so that whatever genetic vulnerability that they have may not be passed on from generation to generation. So the next thing we can say about genetics, and I suppose we always quite like the biological explanation, this is a biological explanation, is of course it's that down to the individual differences. So why some people? Okay, so we could have two people with the same environment or the same pressures, and yet somehow only some of them go on to become addicts. Okay, so that's really quite important. We need to kind of appreciate the risk factor of genetic vulnerability, may explain why some people become addicts and others. And so we can build something like the diathesis stress model into this. That's, with a biological trigger, genetic vulnerability, along with the stress, we go on to develop genetics. It also potentially poses the question that, some people may exist with a genetic vulnerability who never go on to become addicts because they don't have that stress or they don't have that particular situation that kind of pushes them kind of over the edge, so to speak. And so it certainly appeals to a lot of people. And one of the few times I make specific reference to the diathesis stress model. Now, as I said, there's lots of research support in that. So what I would say is choose one of these, maybe two of them at most, and just kind of use them as your research support. We've got Noble here talking about dopamine receptors, specifically for cocaine, kind of building this picture where cocaine kind of blocks particular aspects of the receptors, and so if you've got fewer receptors, you've got more chance of becoming an addict. We've got Connor talking about the D2 receptor. We don't need to know kind of the specifics between A1, D2 and all these different things, but what we do know is that this polymorphism, so in other words, this kind of changing of the dopamine receptors as related to nicotine and alcohol use seems to be a prevalence in some people rather than others. And then the last one comes from Smith, talking about the D2 receptor once again in polydrug abuse, because it makes perfect sense. If I have fewer receptors and all I need is that particular dopamine trigger, I'm likely to take more than one drug. So polydrug, any drug that kind of works for me. Okay, so having used one of those studies, or maybe more than one of those studies, we just simply say that you might inherit a particular gene variant, and that makes you vulnerable. So you inherit, let's go back to here, so inherit a gene variant, and that makes you vulnerable. And that's the key to this whole section. Okay, so and links to this idea of low levels of dopamine, and of course the drugs will increase dopamine activity and therefore will be stimulating and hard to resist. Now, just to kind of move towards the end of this, what we find is that we need to always have the however part of this. It's even kind of linked to the diethystress. Without the environment, you could even use that 56% that we looked at earlier. Would the person still develop the addiction? Okay, and this is a genuine kind of thing, because if we look at different models of understanding addicts, somebody with a good social support maybe doesn't have too much trauma in their lives or too much experience, or peers to kind of encourage them to kind of turn to drugs and alcohol and things like that. They may never develop an addiction. Okay, where others might have those experiences, and because of their genes, it's not their thing. Okay, so there's lots of things that we need to think about this. So that's just the first part. I've done it in 5 parts to hopefully make these videos kind of easier to kind of accept. Please continue just plugging away, do little and often, do it when you can. I'm perfectly happy for you at this stage to, if you want to do a creative task rather than any of the other written tasks, I will probably put a question later on this week that will be written, so I'm kind of doing a combination of both. The key to all of this is please keep on working with us. Miss Harris asks you to email her just to kind of just check in with her. Please do that. If you don't do that, we get genuinely worried and we have to talk to Miss Marshall and other people in the school, and you don't want to have that embarrassment of me phoning you up or something along those lines. It's not to check up on you in a negative way, though obviously I would like to encourage some of you who perhaps have been a little bit lazy with some of your work to kind of, not to be lazy, because we need to kind of keep on ticking, keep on going, because the exams will be hard if you kind of have stopped for the past 2 months. So that's it for me. I hope you do have a good kind of week. I will be posting a few things hopefully onto the Google Classroom quite soon, and we can talk about kind of hopefully meeting you in some kind of different way in the near future. I can't talk about what we're going to do because it's a little bit unclear at the moment, and the school has to make a sensible decision about what is safe and what is right. But certainly we're hoping to have some kind of meaningful interaction with you in the future. So take care, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye.